Okay, so welcome to the Strange Attractor podcast. This is a podcast where we delve into the meta crisis, so to speak, where we listen to the new emerging trends in philosophy and sociology and psychology and see what's coming up, say, after not only modernity, but also postmodernity. And this time, we decided we want to do a politics roundtable. And so the basic question that we have is, since in politics, the modern and the postmodern systems doesn't really, work to deal with the manifold crisis. So we want to ask, what kind of systems change do we need? What kind of constructive ways we must employ to create a new systems of politics after postmodernity. So that's the general gist of it. And we know, and I already mentioned that, we know that politics in itself is a very complex issue. And so what Dennis and I decided is to highlight certain aspects that we found for us interesting, that we presumed would be interesting to you guys, and that would be interesting for the, for the audience, so to speak. And so we try to delve into topics like narrative warfare, the media landscape, maybe cancel culture, hyperpolarization, and those things. So also we want to look if there are really new solutions to politics. So what comes up after postmodernity? And so for that very reason, we invited all of you, because we think you have so many great ideas and so much to say. So first and foremost, and to begin with, Thaddeus Russell, thank you for being here. You're an American professor of history. You're an author and the creator of Renegade University. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Daniel, you were already part of the first episode. You're a Swedish sociologist, a metamodern philosopher, and author of The Listening Society and the Nordic Ideology. Thank you for being here. Steve McIntosh is an American integral philosopher and, amongst other books, the author of Developmental Politics. Thank you, Steve, for being here. Max Borders is an author of Social Singularity and After Collapse. He is a futurist and the executive director at Social Evolution, amongst other things. Max, thank you for being here. And last but not least, John Bunzl is a British entrepreneur, economist, and the author of the SIMPOL Solution. Thank you, John, for being here. So, Thad, let's just start with us too. So I have to create a context here and to create somewhat of a baseline. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. So he speaks of a narrative civil war we are embedded and engulfed in, so to speak, that has entered not only at the private sector of our lives. So, and in the same sense, Renée Resta from the Stanford Internet Observatory, she speaks of a warm world war we are in. So, which is not fought with military means, but with and over narratives. So it's like all about narratives. So, and so it seems that we are somewhat stuck in a postmodern condition where, as Lacan put it, the symbolic is way more important than the real, right? And, the grand narratives of modernity like progress and science and democracy kind of fell apart and into micro narratives that's now kind of battling it out, right? And so, we can go in into some examples of that. I think like one, Baudrillard, he had a fantastic example about, the Reagan administration and the PR team around Reagan that was creating a myth around that person, that harked back to his time as an actor and, the Western myth. And so that had nothing to do with, the reality of who he was, basically. And so it's like also like the idea of biopolitics from Foucault and Agamben to shift public perception to the employment of narrative. So, and so the first question is like, is that an assessment you would kind of share? Would you critique it? What's your take on it? Or more generally, like how has entered post-modernity politics in your estimation?
I mean, there is certainly a narrative war, and I'm going to speak mostly about the United States because I'm a typical parochial, ignorant American, and that's all I know about. But I do know a few things about American politics, and what I see happening over here is a really dramatic shift in the way that people are talking about politics, which is that certainly on the left side of politics, there has been a decided, concerted, dramatic shift toward what I'm calling eliminationism. So prior to Trump, the Democratic Party and its allies tolerated the Republican Party essentially as a junior partner in building the American empire. The Republican Party for most of the 20th century more or less went along with it. There were some exceptions when there was isolationism here and there in the Republican Party, but for the most part, and certainly since Vietnam, the Republicans have been in lockstep actually with the Democrats on expanding the American empire and maintaining it. That's changed with Trump when Trump began to just mention some skepticism about the existence of NATO and things like that. There was a collective psychotic freakout among the foreign policy establishment and the political establishment, which really is what led the entire anti-Trump movement. But so now what we hear, and especially since the election, is this rhetoric about domestic terrorism. And we see that that's obviously being conflated with, and this is what's remarkable, this is what I'm getting at. When they talk about domestic terrorism, they're talking about regular old Republicans, regular old conservative Republicans, Reagan-type Republicans, people who used to be normal parts of American political discourse are now is an attempt to essentially outlaw them. They are outlawed in the mainstream media, most of which, of course, is controlled by the Democratic Party over here. But there is now talk of removing all the vestiges of old America. Shelby Steele has this really brilliant analysis that Donald Trump represents the old America that we as Americans are all ashamed of. He's kind of the old Archie Bunker. He's the pre-civil rights. He's the guy who says the impolitics things about race and sex and gender, and he's embarrassing. He's like the uncle who comes to Thanksgiving and says the things that you're not supposed to say and humiliates all of us. And so it's this existential crisis where we look at this person as part of this family and he's deeply humiliating to us. So he must be eliminated from our consciousness and from our culture. Our culture cannot have any vestige of the past in it. And so that's why they are talking about these new legal categories, domestic terrorist, and hunting them down. And certainly in the discourse, in the networks, in the New York Times and all the major media, they are speaking of the nationalist populist movement. And now I'm moving outside the United States because this is a global phenomenon, as you all know. They're speaking of that. They're conflating that with every bad thing that's ever happened in Western history, racism, white supremacy, colonial, et cetera, et cetera. And they are saying it cannot exist. And the nationalist populists on their side, Bannon over here, the Le Pens in France, Farage in the UK, et cetera, are saying similar things, that, you know, the progressive globalist elites are destroying Western civilization, and they don't say they must be eliminated, but the rhetoric is warlike. So yeah, I do see a narrative war, and I see it changing. There's no longer toleration of the loyal opposition. Now there's an attempt to eliminate it.
So if I may ask you, Thaddeus, good to meet you, by the way. Do you see an opening to some kind of more constructive, integrative, healing relationship to the past? I don't know a lot about you, but you're a historian, and it kind of sounded like you were alluding to something like that.
Well, I'm not one for, I forget what the words you used were, but no, no, there's going to be continued fights. and it's simply a matter of which side you want to be on, whose side you want to be on in the fight. My work is about people who are completely outside the establishment, who are outside the system, who are not formally political. My work is on the outcasts. Some might call them the lumpen proletariat, but I argue that simply by doing things that they're not supposed to do, by violating core social norms, they enlarged freedom in those spheres that we all then entered. So criminals, by selling liquor, for instance, during Prohibition, made alcohol essentially legal in this country, right? And I have the whole book devoted to people like that, who were the outcasts, who were the immoral at the time. And so they're completely outside of formal politics. And those are my models. And that's who I think we should look for, look to. And so I'm a decentralist. My answer here is that electoral politics, high formal politics in this country, and I think globally, are headed straight toward world war. And I could go on further about that. I think there's developments in Asia and the Middle East that are lining up just like World Wars I and II, I'm afraid to say. And so to me, the only thing that's going to save truly my life, our lives, is decentralism as fast as possible. And that's what I think that anybody who's interested in the kinds of things that we are interested in must be pushing at all times. And that's what we should always be doing. Decentralization of our own work, and to encourage it among all others. And at the core of it, and this is the last thing I'll say, at the core of it, to me, the fundamental problem in politics, and this is transnational, this is transhistorical, is the merger of the individual's identity with the nation state. I am an American, I am a German, I am British first, or even as a part of our identity, even any part of, the more that the nation state overlaps with our identity, our individual identity, the more that they can do to us, with us, the more that they can manipulate us, the more they can push us around. And we can't say anything back to them, because then we have already established them as essentially our family. And so it's the decoupling of the individual psychologically, which is really kind of what Frantz Fanon was talking about with colonialism. I think we all need to go through post-colonialism. I think we've all been colonized psychologically by the nation state. And that's what we have to go through psychologically. Get America out of your goddamn head. It's not you. Those people are not you. They're not your family. They're not your friends. They don't have your interests. You must separate yourself as an individual from this entity that was created 5 minutes ago, by the way, in human history. The nation state is brand new. So it's this absurd, terrible fiction, by the way, that has killed more people than any other social construct in world history. So nationalism must go, and the only way to get to eliminate it is to get people to think about who they are as an individual, and whether they want that entity in their identity, as part of their identity, as it's constituting their identity, which to me is exactly what led to the death camps and the atom bomb and Vietnam and the draft, and I can go on forever. So that's to me it's to devolve, constantly devolve toward the individual, toward the smallest community possible, toward limit the jurisdictions of the government if it must exist constantly. And that's a never-ending fight. There is no end to it. You must always fight against that, the merger of the identity of one's identity with the state, and against centralization. And I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, guys, any one of you who would like to jump in? I look at John, I look at Max, and I also look at Steve. All of these points, like developmentalism or decentralization or the nation state, any topic. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can't really understand any of these problems, including the polarization that's going on right now, without understanding that we live in a globalized economy, and that means that that contributes, or the mismatch between a globalized economy on one side and only national governance on the other, contributes to this meaning crisis that we're in. Because I think if you look over the last sort of 30, 40 years, the free movement of capital globally means all nations have to compete to attract that capital and that investment. And that means that both political parties or both main factions, once they're in power, have to adopt a fairly narrow range of competitiveness-oriented policies. And I think citizens generally now, that contributes to the meaninglessness of politics, because whoever you vote for, you end up getting pretty much the same results. And I think that has been the case up until Brexit and Trump. So I think that's the background that we need to understand. And Brexit and Trump was a rebellion against that, against the problems of globalization, which of course are bringing a lot of immigration from south to north. But I think once Brexit is already here, nothing will change, because whoever's in power, even in the UK, still has to keep the UK internationally competitive. So the same processes will continue. But I don't think, I must disagree with Thaddeus, that I don't think the answer is to get rid of national identity as if that were possible. I think it's a question of transcending and including it. It's a question of recognizing where it is, where it works, where it is valuable, where it is healthy, but also recognizing where it isn't valuable, where it's destructive, where it is unhealthy, and then moving up to a higher global level of politics that is really capable of dealing with the global issues that we're all facing.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
What is it that you think that is healthy and valuable about nationalism?
Well, I think it's like any level of identity. You have to have a certain community, and nation states didn't evolve from nowhere. When they first evolved, they were seen by many as a huge relief from the Inquisition of the Catholic Church and all the rest of it, and the horrors of the previous level, the pre-national level. I think the problem now is that because our economy has gone global, but governance is still mainly national, nation states are just unable to deal with the problems that confront us. And so I would say that, where an issue can be legislated upon nationally without incurring any competitive disadvantage, international competitive disadvantage, that's where the usefulness of the nation state ends. Mm-hmm. And where we are talking about issues that can only be solved by all or sufficient nations acting together, that's where our identity and our politics need to expand to the global level. And if you make that distinction, you start to see, okay, well, the national level is okay for this, but we need a global level for that. And I think then that you can start to integrate the two. I think the problem right now is that it's all in a mess. And that's why we're seeing a lot of the kind of pathologies that we're seeing right now.
So,
Daniel,
one last comment on that before we then slowly move on to the next, and then we can still come back to any of the open points that you still have, but we just make sure we hear everybody originally. Okay, thanks.
Well, yes, thank you, Dennis. I was curious to hear both Max and Steve on this as well, but my own take is that there really is some kind of both and there is a transformational both and that goes some ascend and descends, right? So it is true that we are in the prison of national identity. And that identity should likely be a much smaller sliver of who we are as citizens and social beings vis-a-vis one another. And I suggest the term to be used is actually an economic term, really, but it can be transposed with identity as well, and it's cosmolocal. We need some kind of cosmolocal citizenship and formulation of the cosmolocal citizenship. So a strengthening of the local community, of its technologies of decision making and governance and participation, and a deepening of its capacities. At the same time, if we only do that, there is still no coordination of all of those huge flows of capital goods, resources, collective commons, and environmental impacts, and all of those things that affect us on a transnational and global level. So at the very same time, there needs to be another layer instituted or stimulated by means of for instance, changing curriculums from national history to big history, or changing the weighting of those things. And big history is a very powerful set of teaching technologies that also link the different sciences and disciplines. And in that cosmolocal citizenship line of thinking, I like to add this distinction between the demos and the ethnos. The demos being this kind of citizenship that is impersonal and systemic vis-a-vis the state. That it's I have the same right as the other person by virtue of being member of the polis, member of the community, having a citizenship in the abstract. The ethnos is the people as a certain language, a certain culture, a certain history. And from the left, you usually have an emphasis on the demos as the people, so to speak. And from the right, you usually have an emphasis on the ethnos. And those try to colonize one another. And the ethnos, interestingly, and demos can be transformed, and as they have throughout history, right? So we're looking for a new kind of ethnos, new forms of ethnic identities and relationships that do not necessarily suppress stuff like national pride and patriotism and stuff like that, or sense of rootedness, which is very important to people also on a spiritual level, and a development of the demos, so that we kind of feel and see these layers. I am a cosmopolitan world citizen, but I don't have to fly around in the abstract around that. I also have a grounding in something local, and there's still some room for me being a citizen of this particular state structure. However, that should become much more volitional, so that we approach the ideals of panarchy, that you can actually choose which state structures you want to live out your life through. I'll stop there.
Max,
Great.
do you? I want to ask Max if you want to add something at this point, or
you're still muted.
I can quickly. I'm
Cool.
I hear a lot I agree with and disagree with from all. I think I am comfortable with the idea of a cosmopolitan outlook or moral sensibility that, you know, that is rooted in some broad humanism, but I am but I'm uncomfortable with the idea of global authorities to try to be that. I tend to agree with Thaddeus in the idea. I would call myself something like an asymptotic anarchist, which is to say, let's get as close as we can to the absence of large power Westphalian authorities as we possibly can. And then I hear, you know, polyarchy or panarchy from Daniel and I light up. And this is the idea that when you have consent-based systems, decentralized consent-based systems, you can start to really unleash evolutionary processes to see what emergent properties come to be. And that evolutionary process can be one of transcend and include, as John Bunzl mentioned, but what particular aspects of globalization or globalism. And I see these as two different concepts. Globalization being sort of the economic and cultural interconnection of peoples of the world on the one hand,
Right.
and globalism being this desire to suppress or control through large institutions in a global manner. I am resistant to that. And so I guess my particular perspective is one of radical decentralization and polyarchy as well. And I think the future of politics is something I call underthrow. And underthrow is the idea of that the sort of the structured demos like authorities, which in the United States at the very least is a giant spectacle where you don't really get anything you vote for, and yet it sets people upon themselves. While this destructive spectacle is unfolding, I really believe there's another process at play, which is underthrow, and that is the ability to nicheify, to carve out smaller governance spaces that are allowed to emerge and compete in parallel with the old Westphalian order. That is really what I'm hoping happens with the nascency of the cryptocurrency revolution, as well as special economic zones and other forms of cultural and economic self-determination. That means that there's no one true way. It is the one true way kind of thinking of high modernism and high minds that I think brings about the negative aspects of globalism.
Amen.
So I found a lot to enrich my thinking
as well.
from everything that I said.
All right. Thank you, Max. Let's move on to Steve. Tom, I would skip the order we had
Sure.
devised before and move to Steve. Tom, do you want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so Steve, you've been working on this concept of developmental politics, and we just heard about the question of identity and why it may be important to retain some kind of national identity, not just throw it away or something like that. But so how do you see that? What's you worked on this concept of post-progressivism, and so how does that tackle the problem of extreme political polarization that we're seeing, especially in the US, but also in other places at the moment? So what's your take on that?
Sure. Well, let me first respond to Thaddeus and say I understand his concern about nationalism. I would say nationalism is certainly ugly, right? And there are many ways we could condemn it. From a developmental perspective, I would argue that it's an unstable but perhaps necessary step toward a more integrated globe, a more decentralized global political situation. But my focus is following, Bismarck, or politics being the art of the possible. I'm not endowed with a huge fortune or lots of recognition or power, so I'm doing what I think is possible, myself and my colleagues at this think tank that we founded some years back, titled the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And so we're focused on American politics, or at least advancing or fostering or cultivating or gently encouraging the evolution of consciousness and culture, because at least from one perspective, America's extremely dysfunctional political condition is, at least in some respects, the result of rapid growth, of rapid cultural evolution over the last 50 years, uneven growth for sure, but a certain segment of the population has evolved in a significant way beyond modernity, beyond traditionalism, beyond these old structures. I can even point to Daniel's excellent term about the culture being stretched out, right? So in other words, the opportunity that we're in now, I mean, what's wrong is not simple, but the opportunity that we're in now, I think is that things have been differentiated to the point where the American polity, at least, no longer coheres as a functionally governable entity. And so this could signal an impending regression, right? The American democracy could collapse under the circumstances. We could have a dictator worse than Trump. I mean, certainly there are many scenarios which have some degree of probability, which involves a significant regression to a pre-democratic or even pre-modern cultural and social condition. However, the other possibility that we see looking at the situation from a developmental perspective is to encourage further development, right? What does that look like? We, at least some of us here, have this theoretical conception of the evolution of consciousness and culture occurring, at least evincing some patterns of dialectical development. And so we see in the Enlightenment, right, modernity emerge from a dialectic with traditionalism. Over the past 50 years, we've seen this kind of fresh worldview which distinguishes itself from both modernity and traditionalism. We call it progressivism. It's sometimes called postmodernism, probably most often within this sort of community of discourse that we're in. But that's confusing because a lot of people think of postmodernism merely as post-structuralist, the philosophical school. We define it more as a large-scale progressive worldview that has many different ideological components, some of which are somewhat incompatible. But nevertheless, it's the thing which has disrupted at least the American cultural consensus for good and bad, right? In other words, we couldn't stick with modernity. It's unsustainable on many levels. We had to break out of that. Much of the evolutionary juice, much of the political will that has been attracted and magnetized to this progressive worldview's vision, I would say is a very positive development. But from a developmental perspective, we can see the dialectical pattern wherein progressivism has gained its political power by rejecting, right, the pathologies of modernity and nationalism and religion and all of these outworn social structures. I think for those critiques land, that they're excellent. But I would say that rejectionism has a fatal flaw, which is its ultimate political impotency. We've seen a lot of cultural gains for progressivism in the United States, but its political gains are still yet to be seen in any large-scale way because it is in this stance of rejection. It has often a hard time convincing the rest of the society to go along with many of its laudable and needed goals. So what we're championing at the Institute for Cultural Evolution and through this new website we're about to launch, kind of a content hub for post-progressive thinking. We're calling it the Post-Progressive Post, if you'll pardon the cuteness of that. We're envisioning a politics of culture that instead of focusing on what's impossible, instead of just airing further grievances, we want to try to move from the antithesis of progressivism to something that comes after it that does what progressivism can't, and that is better integrate the entire cultural ecosystem of the American polity. And when I say integrate, I don't mean as if there's going to be, a lack of political conflict. But one of the ways that we're making this perspective of this post-progressive perspective potentially accessible to the larger group of people who not interested in a new worldview, they want their worldview to triumph, is we're championing the idea of the defined term we're calling cultural intelligence. And just like in the 90s, everybody wanted to have emotional intelligence, defining cultural intelligence as the ability to step outside your own worldview and recognize a certain degree of interdependence between the positive values of the entire culture. In other words, that while we may reject religion, there are elements of this traditional worldview, right? Sacrifice, self-interest for the good of the whole, a sense of virtue. There are these elements that are really foundational to our larger civilization that we can't just eliminate, I would argue, and I do at length in Developmental Politics. Likewise with modernity, right? It's unsustainable, it pollutes, it's creating global warming, it's a catastrophe on many levels, admittedly. But it also brings about these liberal values, this sphere of personal freedom, sovereignty, where at least theoretically, you're protected from the dictates of the collective. And as I argue at length elsewhere, the emergence of these liberal values are like the Cambrian explosion in cultural evolution, right? Just like the Cambrian explosion produced the backbone, the vertebrate, upon which all these higher levels of biological organization were founded. I would argue that these liberal values give us a political backbone, that they make us citizens. and that this is an element of modernity that we need to carry forward even as we transcend the pathologies of modernity. Likewise with progressivism, very important new layer of moral concern. We're not going to build a higher level of civilization without these very important progressive values. But we need to do what progressivism can, as I mentioned, and that is better appreciate how the best of all of these cultural stages of development are in an interdependent ecosystem. And just like in a biological ecosystem, if you wipe out the plankton, the whales are going to die. If we wipe out some of these enduring values that we need to build a future and better and more inclusive and functional political form of organization, then we're going to need to recognize these underlying cultural dynamics and create a politics that can integrate grievance and gratitude, that can see how that there's this indestructible polarity at the base of almost every human polity. And that is those who are focused on fixing what's wrong and those who are concerned with preserving what's right. And that taken to the extreme, both of these poles lead to pathology, right? Either a reification of the status quo or a fantasy that we can just wipe away the best of what's come before and start fresh. So when we recognize that these things are indestructible, these two political poles continue to reappear, and there's even evidence that they're hardwired into our biology, or at least tendencies toward them, then we can begin to see what a synthesis actually looks like, not just at a political policy level or at a structural level, but at an internal level within our own consciousness. That's what this post-progressive worldview attempts to do, is for each person as a citizen to try to integrate the polarity of fixing what's wrong and preserving what's right, grievance and gratitude within themselves, right? That's what a higher level of consciousness begins to look like. So it's a politics of culture that wants to encourage further evolution in the internal universe, in people's consciousness and culture, with the, I think, reasonable expectation that many of the structural and physical elements of the crisis that we're in, that's the best solution and the best place to focus. So I can say a lot more, but that's a mouthful.
Can I just, I'd like to ask you, Steve, whether you feel that integration or of those very, all the valuable, what's valuable and worth retaining from all the prior levels, whether that's something that can actually be done anymore in any nation alone. But just before you answer, I just want to come back just to clarify for Max and Thaddeus that, when I talk about a global layer of politics, I'm not talking about a world government or a world authority. I'm against that. I don't think we need that. I think we need international cooperation, not another layer of government. So I just wanted to make that clear. But anyway, I just
need governance, not governance, not government, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I guess I would not to cut you off on this, but I mean, I actually would like for you to flesh that out a bit. I don't know. I actually don't know what that means. I know what you don't want, but I'm not sure what you mean by international. Was it cooperation? You said? Yeah,
there's a book called The SIMPOL Solution. I can send you the details later. We can take a look at our website if you like.
Well, we'll get to the simultaneous policy approach, SIMPOL. That's what the abbreviation stands for. We get to it when we get to John, so you can explain a little more what this approach looks like. But it is about global governance and not global government. Just to get you all peace of mind now for now. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow on to Steve's a little bit just for a moment. In thinking about this sort of meta order of pluralism, where you try to integrate various conceptions of the good, try to see the value of all of them and think of them in ecosystems fashion. I tend to think of it in similar fashion, and I think this probably comes from, we share a common interest, I'm sure, in spiral dynamics, integral theory, and Herr Freinacht's work, but at the end of the day, there's a through line for me, or running orthogonal to all these questions, is a good old-fashioned liberal question, or you could say, or the question between to what degree we have a liberal order and what degree we have an authoritarian order. To what extent are the cultural or systems niches emergent, as in they come out of consent-based systems, or are they compelled and they come out of non-consent-based systems, compulsory systems, where if by virtue of dropping on this patch of soil, you become a citizen of this country and are expected to obey its laws, pay its taxes, and so on. This, in my mind, the only way to reach, Steve, there's an asymmetry between the authoritarian aspect and the consent-based aspect, in that in consent-based systems, you are able to have these experiments in living. And that's a very kind of modern idea that comes out of Mill and Hume and the like. And if we were to jettison that particular set of values too early, consent-based systems, we don't get the kind of radical experimentation in pluralism that allows us to explore these different cultural, ethnic, economic, and otherwise niches that can emerge with true liberalism underlying it. So your post-progressivism resembles very closely my integral liberalism, and I think that's interesting. And it also, I think, betrays a little bit of my, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But very interesting.
Great. Well, let me just applaud the idea of consent-based systems and hope that in the future, just about everything possible is consent-based. I think as consciousness evolves, legal constraints, legal authority can lessen. In other words, laws just make up the gap between how society should be, how we need to require folks who are living among us to follow, respect each other's freedoms. I mean, these are just political basics. But I think that this idea of consensus and consent-based focus is something that is at the founding ideal of liberalism. And as I argued, we can't leave it there. We have to keep evolving. There's more to it than that. I would just argue that's a very important moral advance upon which further moral evolution is dependent.
Well, and both of you brought up global collective action problems, and I want to acknowledge that I didn't address that in what I said, and it needs to be acknowledged. I'll just put it there.
Sure. Let me just also acknowledge John's question about global cooperation is certainly necessary, especially when it comes to climate change and the turmoil that many of our national polities are currently in is making that more difficult than it was even 10 years ago. So that's certainly part of what's wrong.
All right, Joe, we'll get to you. Okay, no Tom, do you want to take the next question?
I have a question for Daniel. So, I mean, like taking into account everything that was spoken about up to this point, you're the creator of metamodernism, but it's like also, an approach after postmodernity, but still we're living in this highly polarized time. It's not just left versus right, or that the media narratives are completely devoid, say, of reality, like what's going on with Black Lives Matter or the COVID policies, or Trump or the woke movement. So like how would you address those real time issues? I mean, we see it with Israel and Hamas right now. It's also a narrative problem, right? And so like how would you approach those actual problems we are facing right now?
Wow. Well, that is perhaps a too difficult question, but thanks Tom for
a challenge to you
for showing me that confidence. But I'll actually link in to the discussion that we were having. let's see, it's such a tricky one. It's about the nature of freedom. I suspect, Max, you were going to say it reveals something about your biological predisposition, personality type predisposition towards the liberal side, and I have the same one, right? The more we delve into that issue, though, the trickier freedom gets, right? Freedom is a collective good because it always depends on the interactions within which we're layered. And freedom is a collective capacity. So if you go back to antiquity or something, and you would expect the kind of rights that we have today, the carrying capacity, cognitively, code-wise, culturally, even economically and technologically, was not there to carry the kinds of freedoms that we take for granted. And in many, many ways, those freedoms are threatened. When we push ahead to or stimulate the pathway towards deeper freedom, we always walk a thin line, right? We always walk a thin line that we might be the bad guys, we might be the new totalitarians, we might be laying the bricks on the road to serfdom. But nevertheless, I think, and this is the thing we in our books that we call the death of the liberal innocent, kind of have to look in the mirror and exert a lot of psychological self-scrutiny and just self-awareness and create practices for that to lure out these ghosts of totalitarianism past that are going to come up in new guises as we try to deepen freedom. This is what the Marxists wanted to do. They never wanted to create an oppressive society. They wanted to create deeper freedom for people, and they miserably failed. So particularly what I have in mind is the thing you said, Stephen, about integrating the spectrum of many different levels of cultural development and the settings they're layered in and so on, and their respective strengths. And to be able to do that, we at the same time need to create the generative conditions that will nevertheless scaffold likelihoods over time, generative conditions, for the stimulation of development into the later stages of development, given that complexity is increasing, which is a horrifically totalitarian move. It's about changing culture. It's about changing outlooks, about changing how people view the world and what they value the most, right? Without anything being shoved down anybody's throats, but these things spontaneously emerging, given that we know from developmental psychology that these are capacities and that they come often with the combination of privilege and challenge. That high level of challenge plus high level of support over time means that you will have transitional crises and you will come out on the other side with a new outlook on your life. And particularly if you have many resources in terms of information and perspectives and a rich network of people to stimulate you and support you, right? Somehow, paradoxically, to expand freedom means to integrate the entire spectrum of human experience and make room for people to be who they are, because otherwise they can't be truly free. Then they'll be oppressed, just like the Pomo straitjackets, right? That, oh, you said this over the wrong word, and people feel horribly oppressed by it, right? Or you're not a pious enough Christian, or you don't belong to this nation, or something else, right? All of that is horribly oppressive. And nevertheless, we have to allow all of those people who have come to those conclusions by a rich lived life experience to flourish as who they are, right? Without oppressing one another. And at the same time, being on some kind of conveyor belt that creates a critical mass of people who are post-progressive or metamodern in their outlooks, so that there can be enough people to push pressure points strategically in the evolving systems, and respond to crises differently, and create bridging narratives, and open up worlds of meaning making, and all of those things. And decentralize, for that matter, also requires incredible complexity, incredible complexity of mind, but also complexity of sensitivity of context and emotions and the people involved, right? So we cannot escape the developmental imperative that underpins the very freedom that we want to save. The only solution I have for that is to begin to work our way towards institutions at whichever level we're working at. So not tying us to the nation state here, but create institutions which support that form of development, and make those institutions democratically governed, so that they are transparent to the people whose lives are shaped by them, but that there are strong enough deliberative mechanisms for the more complex truths to win over, and then more nuanced and comprehensive ways of thinking to win over the more black and white or good guy, bad guy ways of thinking. So particularly if we look at an issue like Israel and Palestine, and I mean it's I mean just to say something, I of course believe that Israel is not responding in a productive manner at this point. I believe that hardliner politics has become dominant in the public opinion, and under the leadership of ethically questionable leadership. But ethically questionable governance. But I feel that a developmental lens could actually be of great significance there, because then it's not truly about Arabs and Palestinians against Israelis and modern life. It is about supporting empowering the freedom to be, the freedom to relate within the Palestine population, so that Hamas will not have such a strong grip of over the population. They become that horribly black and white, half fascist ideology breeds on mutilated development, right? On lives that are lived in straitjackets, right? And under her dignity and all of that. At the same time, within Israel itself, looking at the deep psychological issues that drive such things as the expansionism into those settlements, there would need to be a kind of serious process from the leadership to address what are the insecurities that are required here. So a profound kind of healing process. And I think the healing process has been a paradigm for a long time between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but there is also the healing process internal to both sides, right? Or to populations across both sides. So a more metamodern politics would say, yes, it is indeed a very bad situation, and Hamas are really doing unacceptable things and shooting rockets into civilian quarters and whatnot. But that's not actually the main issue. Every step of development takes 2 steps of healing, right? So we would likely have to address the issue at an institutional level to what supports the level of inner safety and security for these people, so that they will not be overreacting violently, and so that their level of freedom increases. And if you say it like that in a setting like the Palestine-Israeli conflict, it doesn't sound as totalitarian, right? People get these totalitarian issues, these totalitarian visions in their mind. Oh no, there's going to be a state. They're going to control us. They're going to look at our subtlest and most personal selves, and they're going to over our heads try to develop who we are as human beings. Well, we don't want that situation. However, we do want to coordinate our agency at those subtler levels of being. And if we do not, our freedom will forever be limited, because our freedom does not stop at the outer border of the other person as a sealed container. It continues right into the heart of the other person. And if that other person wishes us well, our freedom increases, right? And wishing other people well is a capacity. So there's this deep depth psychologically, this capacity building of depth psychology that needs to become a transparent democratic project with which people are democratically involved, and which has the facilitation mechanisms to bring out those subtler issues, or else we always skim the surface and talk about unemployment and housing and all of those things that are important.
You are, so basically that's the outline of a listening society, as you call it, like a society that is kind of hip to interiors, that is informed that interiors are real, that they matter, and that they can show developmental sequence, and that we should use whatever knowledge we have to foster any healing and any advance on this path, like the Nordic, the Nordic countries have done in the past, right? The whole Bildung and Volksbildung, or whatever, all that kind of projects that have propelled the northern countries to be the most progressive, liberal, and freedom-loving places, as far as we know. Great. So looking at the clock, we should shift over to the next speaker. So let's move on to Max, and let's have a look at your work and what you're currently up to. So I recently read your book After Collapse, in which you describe basically it's a slightly attentionalist title, as you concede, but it's a real possibility. And if we look at American politics, there are some things that are seriously clashing, and they might be crashing. So what is the impending collapse that you write about in your book After Collapse, and that you see in the US? So that's the first part of the question. And the second part would be, what are the solutions for a post-collapse society, and what is this integral liberalism that you teased us with? So, your floor.
Sure, thank you. I happen to have it here. It's a good thing. But there's 7 dimensions of what I call breakdown in American society, and I don't mean this to be, as Thaddeus said earlier, parochial American stuff. It's a framing device in one sense, and in another, it's very real problems. But the first thing is the breakdown of the metaphors and models we use to talk about American society. I think a lot of experts and authorities are stuck in a kind of machine metaphor, that there are these causal relationships in society that can be understood and manipulated in certain ways to give about some pro-social effect. I criticize this view, but think it's so pervasive that it's leading to the breakdown of the social order in many respects, particularly as those who would control the economy and society are under the sway of these broken metaphors. The second is the breakdown of hierarchies, and I appeal to complex adaptive systems theory in this, particularly the work of Bar-Yam, and someone mentioned Hayek earlier, but the idea is that hierarchies break down and there are replacements on the horizon for hierarchical orders. And I mean, what I mean by that is rigid hierarchies or dominance hierarchies, where you subordinate someone, or either through sticks and carrots subordinate to create some sort of collective action. And hierarchies tend to break down due to information problems of complexity. The third is the breakdown of our belief in liberalism, our belief in the idea that that people ought to be, that not only that freedom and self-organization is a good thing, but some of the liberal values that come along with that. And these are ancient values. They start, you know, many millennia ago. So it's not just a Western weird thing. The fourth is the breakdown of community and mutual aid. With the rise of the sort of collectivist welfare states, we saw the sort of the diminishment of close ties, mutual aid ties, where you know the people in your community and you're able to make certain kinds of assessments about whether or not someone is in need of financial support or a kick in the ass or whatever, or just a stern talking to, or a hug. I mean, these are not things that states do well. And when we allowed hypercapitalism to proceed in parallel with the welfare state, people began to outsource their sense of responsibility and compassion for others, because I pay my taxes and someone else is doing it. So that is continuing to break down. The breakdown of collective intelligence is really how we know, how we track truth. And I am sensitive to the postmodern plight. We are mediated by screens, and indeed we are subjective entities. We haven't stopped being situated in our subjectivity. But as a nod to the metamoderns or the second tier folks, it is important to begin to craft narratives and good old-fashioned ideas about where creating systems where you have skin in the game, or whether there are higher costs to being wrong in your opinions and your assessments. Right now, it's a low-cost proposition to hold all sorts of stupid beliefs, and people therefore do them. In fact, they get rewarded for holding stupid beliefs, and nobody tracks truth. And we're seeing that in the age of fake news and narrative warfare now. It's rather a hall of mirrors. Sixth, the breakdown of discourse and civil order, and particularly the reactionaries on the one side and the victimologist on the other. This is this is the rise of wokeism alongside the rise of the other side, which are reactionaries, trolls, and so on. And they suck all the oxygen out of real conversations that deliberative and people like you guys want to have. It just becomes a spectacle between people with Molotov cocktails on the left and tiki torches on the right, and it just creates a massive shit show for the rest of us. Excuse my language. And finally, we have the breakdown of the federal government. We're just simply unsustainable spending, debt spending that could lead to sovereign debt crisis. I think is something that needs to have the kind of have the energy around it, and just the focus on that for future generations, because we're essentially handing our children and grandchildren a massive tsunami of red ink, and we are going to drown in it if we're not careful. So the institutions, the ghastly Leviathan institutions that slink at the bottom of the ocean of red ink, no one is looking at, and to me, these fiscal issues are just as important as issues like the health of our global ecosystems and so on. So that's generally the framing on all these dimensions. We're breaking down in American society, and I think in many other societies as well. And this creates unhealthy and unsustainable dynamics. I'm framing it as collapse. Yes, it's sensational, but I have to compete in an evolutionary fitness landscape with other sensational titles. So you'll forgive me for that. Hopefully, once you get into the book, you'll see something a little subtler and a little more interesting than sensational title. I won't talk about, I'll just sum up part 2 so I don't bang on, and I want to give everyone else time. Part 2 is really, starting with the idea of reimagining liberalism, this integral liberalism, where we re-embrace what I call the spheres, and the spheres being these ancient moral practices that turn out to be rather immortal, and they, for very good reasons, resemble the yamas from the Yoga Sutras and some of the other Vedic traditions, but also they synthesize with some of the Western notions that we're more familiar with. And I believe that if we re-embrace these culturally, these as cultural values and internalize them as active practices, so instead of thinking of bare abstract moral rules, if you think of active moral practices, we become more and more trained in our moral sensibilities. And this isn't something I would have said a few years ago, but I'm coming around to this view, so much so that I made it the basis of part 2. And that what gets unleashed from this idea of these ancient moral practices that I believe are universal and timeless in some sense is this polyarchic order, this emergent, continual decentralized order where we see systems like holacracy emerge within corporations, which you might know as teal organizations, sociocracy similarly, that these kind of organizational dynamics are what is meant to replace old hierarchies, and that these can scale. And what we'll start to see is this polyarchic order based on consent, and frankly based on human respect, and not so much on the purported wisdom or expertise of authorities. And so it really is this slow movement towards asymptotic anarchy after collapse.
Awesome. Thank you very much for this sweeping overview. Any of the panelists care to chime in here?
I'd like to engage with Max about what you said. That sounds very interesting. I look forward to reading your book. As you described part 1 and all of the various lines of decay, we could maybe call it, I wouldn't argue with the general outlines of that. The way I like to look at it, though, in terms of my hopelessly optimistic outlook, is that there are certainly gnarly forces of decay, and those are always present, in greater or lesser intensity in any societal situation. But I would say that there's also forces of growth, that are not entirely countervailing, but we wouldn't be where we are now if there wasn't something to overcome the incessant, entropy of decay in our cultural circumstances. So you talked about the polyarchic as a beginning of a description of where you're identifying the force of growth or the countervailing potential to go beyond. Do you see it as inevitably we're going to have to crash and collapse before the forces of growth can gain more traction? Or is there, maybe you could elaborate more on the potential of those forces of growth to triumph in spite of decay, or maybe even in lieu of collapse?
Yeah, that is my deepest hope, of course. One hopes in writing a book that you show people the way, or that you join with a whole bunch of other people like the folks sitting here who share similar thoughts and sensibilities, and that these spread outward, and suddenly we have all these more experiments that are running in parallel with the decaying order, no doubt. And my hope is that it could be viewed as in hindsight as the collapse of the old order, or the realization that one of the things I discuss is the thanatos versus eros as these motivating instincts within us, as well as the masculine and the feminine. And I argue that the eros feminine is rising, and that this is actually a good thing, and that the thanatos feminine is also something we need to pay attention to, which is this both let it flow instinct in us and let it go. So let it flow being the generative instincts, allowing some of these parallel structures to emerge and to flower, but also letting go of this old order a little bit, because it is perhaps no longer serving us. And to the extent that we can take the, the healthy aspects of the old order, internalize it, and have that be fertilizer for this new growth after collapse, absolutely. But I don't want or hope or even draw much of a picture of devastation. I warn that it could be absolutely devastating, and I don't want us to collapse into warlordism, or, as you described it earlier, Steve, a pre-modern state, or factionalized, balkanized, and otherwise ugly. But we do see these cycles of beginnings and endings, as we have with all empires. And I think Thaddeus is right that we are an empire in the United States, and that it is unsustainable in its scope and in its reach. So not just externally in terms of foreign relations, but internally in terms of all the special interests and groups that politics attempts to satisfy with its transferism. So I think that's just a wonderful question, and I'm so glad you brought it up, because I do want to emphasize the after part, and hopefully, after doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to happen after. It doesn't have to be a collapse scenario, that it can actually just be a transition that is somewhat seamless, that has, pockets of disturbance and disruption, but doesn't have to go to zero before it reascends. Absolutely.
Well, maybe good point to shift to the next.
Give me a second, Dennis. Thaddeus,
Sure.
what's your take on this?
Okay.
Well, as I understand it, everyone here, including my good comrade Max, has expressed at least some sympathy for liberalism. You will not hear any sympathy for liberalism from me. And let me go even farther and set even more people's hair on fire. I am talking about both its classical and its 20th century variants. I think that both need to be jettisoned entirely. And I can get into it. I can do a sort of schematic critique of both real quickly, just to get people shouting at me. But to me, in its classical form, John Locke said that the problem with the Indians is that they are not maximizing the utility of the land they're living on. The gorgeous North American plains with all its fertile soil. And therefore, they needed, he said, to be replaced by productive people, by productive settlers. That idea also within classical liberalism of the productive individual also depended upon the idea of the self-disciplining, self-regulating individual, which is at the core of both Puritanism and Victorian culture, which reigns supreme in this country, unfortunately, and still do to a large extent. So that's something I hate the most about the United States, as a matter of fact, is our puritanical culture. And that actually comes from classical liberalism. Now, the 20th century version of liberalism is a death machine. I don't see anything in it worth, to me, 20th century liberalism is eugenics, it's the atom bomb, it's Vietnam. It is social workers in Black women's houses in the projects asking them who they slept with. It's children being put into cages every day that are called schools and kept there. It is global hysteria, lockdown, panic about COVID, when we knew exactly how to treat it correctly, which was to treat the people who are actually vulnerable to it rather than a universal, right? Very liberal idea, very progressive idea. Everyone must sacrifice for, I guess, the common good, which of course is derived from Christianity, which is progressivism's base. The empire, the American.
Can I just respond to that laundry list?
Sure. Go ahead, sure.
Just about everything you listed there is not under any conception of liberalism that I'm familiar with. Now, we have to make a distinction between the 20th century variant of modern liberalism, which is just an outgrowth or repackaging or rebranding of progressivism, early 20th century progressivism, which was eugenicist, which was, you know, and so on. John Locke happens to have had some quite classical liberal ideas, such as the idea of making property productive. But the idea of property rights, if extended to Native Americans, would have protected them. And so, you know, it's just like any philosophical worldview, and at whatever stage of you healthy aspects, I want to say that none of the things you named in my conception of liberalism, and I think it would be a bit unfair even to ascribe most of the things you said to the classical liberals apart from Locke. But in terms of the history of ideas, it sounds like what you're describing is a whole lot of different apologetics for either authoritarian variants or progressivism, early 20th century progressivism. So I think we just, to get our terms straight, we wouldn't radically disagree. I don't think.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I'm confused because when I talk about 20th century liberalism, this is who I'm talking about. I name names. I can name names: Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. So those are people everyone in the world calls liberals. So I don't know why they're not liberals to you. Well, I mean, I guess I'm steeped in the language of the philosophical traditions. So, for example, you might around the world, most people who identify as liberals, the Americans call libertarians. No, I understand that. I know. That's why I said the classical liberalism and 20th century liberalism are very different things. They both deeply inform our culture, both here and in Europe, and I think they are both deeply problematic and both need to be jettisoned in their entirety. That's my radical take, but I think they're different. I hear you. They're very different in many ways, but they are both deeply problematic from my perspective.
So, you know, values like freedom, toleration. I mean, just these are classical liberal values. You think that should be jettisoned?
So I don't think they're actually freedom and toleration. Well, I think the toleration is a terrible concept, actually. So what toleration is, which comes actually from not so much Locke, but actually Thomas Paine and others, but it doesn't matter. I think we're on the same page on what it means. It means that I'm going to allow you, I'm going to give you permission to say what you want to say, maybe. I'm going to allow you, I'm going to give you permission to be Black or a woman in this space. I'm going to allow you and give you, we as a society are going to tolerate you. I mean, there's also an element of condescension and paternalism in the word. I don't like the word at all. And then freedom, as I said, go ahead.
Well, if I can jump into it, because we have now in Germany, and Germany is a pretty liberal country, we have now the discussion that, you know, after COVID and after, you know, everybody was stripped of their civil rights, we only get the rights back if we get a medical intervention, like a vaccination. And it's like, it doesn't really matter, you know, how many people, you know, were sick or died, but it's like a novum in history that happens. And so this is like, I think what Thaddeus is addressing. So this coercion is so deeply ingrained in our Protestant and Lutheran kind of way.
No. Really quickly, it's actually internal. It's internal repression more than external oppression that I'm talking about.
Right.
That's classical liberalism, the John Locke, Thomas Jefferson version, the 19th century version, the self-regulating individual. That's what that is. That's repression. That says if you don't repress yourself, the state will repress you to keep you in order. Right. That was the core of American culture from the get-go. So that's repressive. That's people internalizing this idea that they must work hard, they must be a member of a family, they must obey the law, they must serve in the military, they must pay their taxes, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I mean. And then modern 20th century liberalism is also, it's about sacrificing oneself for the greater good. That's COVID. That's why, have you guys noticed? Liberals absolutely, I hope I'm not offending someone. Maybe I'm happy to offend someone here. Have you not noticed that liberals have just loved wearing masks and they've loved the lockdowns? I mean, they really have, like, it's an aesthetic affinity with it. It's really something that turns them on. And I think that's because progressivism, again, 20th century version, 20th century liberalism, is about collectivism, and it's about the shared sacrifice. That's why they love wartime. That's why the progressives all supported all the big wars of the 20th century, because they love to see a homogenized culture that functions essentially like a factory. That's what we're getting.
Okay. I would like to bracket this conversation for now. We could, in the end, come back to open points. I would like to give the word to John, and also to give him the chance to present like his take on globalism and the nation state and those topics, and also maybe the rise of authoritarianism and what it has to do with voting, and what the simultaneous policy campaign is, and what problem it tries to solve in this context. Maybe you can pick up on some of the threads that we've heard here and connect it to the simultaneous policy campaign that you devised, John.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of agreement in our group here. The question really is, how do you actually operationalize that? How do you boil that down into a political campaign that is actually practical and feasible? I mean, SIMPOL is coming back to the question of governance without government. SIMPOL, simultaneous policy, is more like a kind of global treaty that's driven by citizens. So it's not about a world government. It's really about it's about those global issues that nations want to solve, but can't solve alone, because any nation that moves first would suffer a sort of economic competitive disadvantage. So that's why we need simultaneous action on those global issues of that kind, because if you can get sufficient nations to move simultaneously, everyone wins. And that applies not just to climate change, but also to a whole host of other global issues, from financial market regulation to tax avoidance to the governance of pollution in space, to even the internet, who knows. But I think the area where it affects the political polarization issue, which I think is probably of most interest, is that if, for example, and I know this is easier said than done, but if, for example, we can get, and governments are actually working on this right now, there's this minimum level of corporation tax that's being negotiated right now. If governments can actually cooperate globally to raise sufficient taxes from multinational corporations, from the tech giants like Facebook and Amazon, and could redistribute, I mean, they won't do that, but if they could, under SIMPOL, redistribute some of those funds to developing countries, so that those countries can start to make, so people in those countries can start to make a decent living in their home country, then the whole issue of mass migration, and should we build a wall or should we just let people in, starts to diffuse. Because if people can make a decent living in their home country, why would they want to move? And so I suppose what I'm trying to say in principle is, until we move to this kind of global cooperative thinking with win-win solutions, there is something in there for both right and left. You will get solutions to climate change, and you will get more secure and settled national identities everywhere. So whereas the postmodernists would talk about multiculturalism, I would talk about simulculturalism.
So there's a root problem that SIMPOL tries to address, a generator function of all of those global problems. It's sometimes called the tragedy of the commons, and Max called it a collective action problem, I think, or coordination problem. So how exactly are we getting those all those countries lined up to cooperate, which, you know, even in non in ordinary times is as difficult as hell. So why would governance wake up one day and say, hey, let's cooperate instead of be at each other's throats? Why would they do it? Why would they care?
There's two ways. One is simply because the level of crisis, you know, that the higher the level of crisis becomes, the more pressure there is for cooperation. And that indeed is why you're seeing governments now talking about a minimum level of corporation tax, raising it up to 21%. Why? Because the crisis of COVID means that they're all up to their eyeballs in debt. They need more revenue. And so now they're starting to think about cooperation. So crisis is one driver, but the driver that we're using in SIMPOL is very simple. Basically, when citizens sign up to SIMPOL, they tell their politicians, they tell their political representatives that they're going to be giving strong preference in all future national elections to politicians who have signed a pledge to implement the simultaneous policy, simultaneously alongside other governments, subject to sufficient other governments also signing up and subject to the policy content being negotiated and agreed. And that very simple declaration by citizens has actually already caused over 100 members of parliament in the UK from right across the political spectrum to sign the SIMPOL pledge. We also have a growing number of politicians in Ireland, Germany, the European Parliament, and in one or two other parliaments around the world. So it's really a way that citizens can use their existing national votes to incentivize politicians to sign up to this global, this simultaneous global treaty idea. And it's very powerful because particularly in first past the post systems, such as we have in the UK, where many individual parliamentary seats are being won and lost on very fine margins, if we get one candidate to sign up, then we get, then the next one has to sign up, and the next one's. So very, quite often in many seats, we've had all the competing candidates have signed up to SIMPOL in advance of the actual election date, and so whoever wins, we win.
So there's no downside. There's no downside to signing up for politicians. Only upsides.
That's right. Yeah, there's no downside because nothing gets implemented until sufficient nations are on board. But if their competitor signs up, but they don't sign up, that they could lose their seat, right? And we never tell them, of course, how many supporters we have in their electoral area, so we keep them guessing. So it's a very powerful process. Of course, that is only valid in democratic countries. So the first question people would ask would be, well, what about non-democratic countries? And to that, the way we look at it is simply that SIMPOL just won't get anywhere if the United Nations process succeeds. If governments succeed in solving these problems, terrific. I can go home and go on holiday. But if they fail, then I think something like SIMPOL could start to become, much more publicly recognized as perhaps the only alternative in town. And then I think at that point, non-democratic nations who also have nothing to lose by joining the process could see this as a viable solution, because they need solutions to global problems too. So and there's no guarantees. We have no idea. We don't say this will work. We're just simply saying, SIMPOL is designed in such a way as to maximize the chances of adequate global cooperation without a government.
But it's a form of saying, okay, we're trying something constructive here, and it's consent based. So So the states basically, first of all, the individuals consent, and then the politicians also consent, and then then the individual nation states consent. And once you got all the ducks lined up in a row, then you can actually move stuff, like important stuff.
Yeah, and also, Dennis, I mean, it's important to say that the voting power that citizens have, this is the bottom-up aspect of SIMPOL, the voting power that we're exerting that is driving the politicians to sign up with, you know, the competitive forces that it's creating to drive them to sign up, also gives citizens in democratic countries the power to have a very strong influence over what the actual policies will be. Okay, so this isn't a question of you know, letting politicians decide what the global solutions will be. This is a kind of bottom-up direct democracy. It's certainly in democratic countries. However, there has to be a negotiation also amongst all nations, including the non-democratic ones. So, you know, you know, this is why the idea of simultaneity is inclusive of democratic countries and non-democratic countries. It's not a kind of globalist fantasy of direct internet democracy.
So, basically, it's not about ideology, but like we all have to believe the same thing. We just all have to do the same thing, right? It's about behavioral changes or like.
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, it's really about how do we solve those problems that the national level just simply can't deal with, you know, climate change, for example. And so it's very practical, and it's also, I think, very it has a very strict criteria about what is a policy, a global policy, and what isn't. So we have you know, for any policy suggestion that comes up, we apply a test to it, and that is, would the unilateral implementation of that policy have a positive or negative effect on that nation's competitiveness, or on that sort of small group of nations' competitiveness. So if it would have a negative effect on its competitiveness, then it is a global problem. It needs simultaneous action. If, on the other hand, it can be dealt with by an individual nation alone, or by a restricted group of nations like the EU, then it's nothing to do with SIMPOL. It's a national problem. And I think that very clear dividing line means that we can actually, coming back to our identity where we started right at the beginning of this discussion, you know, with that dividing line, we can say, right, yeah, this is my healthy national identity for those issues that really can be dealt with at the national level. But here, through SIMPOL, I can exercise my global identity by using my national vote to drive solutions to those global level problems.
So this is a kind of subsidiarity inbuilt, which then also maybe connects back to the notion of this Cosmo local identity, which Daniel talked about.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So we now move into the open 15 minutes, let's say, of open discussion, and yeah, anyone who might want to react or contribute.
Max, you wanted to say? You wanted to say something, Max?
I was just going to keep talking about John's SIMPOL idea, and if that's appropriate for this time, I want to better understand it. I do like I do like the idea, at least as a pragmatic compromise, of some sort of you know, principle of subsidiarity, and yet I am pretty intellectually hostile to the idea of a majoritarian democracy. You said it doesn't resemble some sort of global direct democracy, and instead is as I understand it from your description, a way of getting people to sign on to simultaneous policy prescriptions at a level, a supranational level, that would oblige the national governments to establish harmonious policies, or or is it's an agreement, a direct agreement that I agree as someone voting to, I don't know, limit my driving or consumption of fossil fuels or whatever. What is, you know, and I do appreciate that you said we always have to ask with specificity, how do we operationalize these issues? How do we operationalize our, you know, grander, more abstract ideas? So I like that. I'm interested in it. And could you give me an example with global warming? Just take one measure. What would people do in people who are living in the Cayman Islands do with SIMPOL?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Max. I mean, another point about this is SIMPOL is not a one-size-fits-all global policy. We're not talking about every nation implementing exactly the same thing necessarily, particularly on climate change. So very, very broadly speaking, what I would envisage is a series of multi-issue global policy packages that would be implemented. So one package in year 1, another one in year 3, another one in year 5, with sort of revision possibilities at each stage. But as far as climate change is concerned, what I would envisage would be that every nation would have to, that the overall aim would be to reduce emissions by, say, 80% by a certain time, or whatever the need is, and each nation would stipulate precisely what it would do to implement that. But alongside the climate agreement would be a global tax raising agreement on multinational corporations or on the Amazons and the Facebooks and so forth, so that those funds could be used to compensate the loser nations on the climate part of the agreement. Okay, so this is like a trade-off situation. I think one of the problems with the current UN process is it's just talking about emissions. And so there is no way for trade-offs or no way for compensatory measures to come in for those nations that have the highest cost, like the US and China, which is why, of course, nothing's happening. But if you can raise billions in tax from the tech giants and redistribute that to national governments on an agreed basis and an agreed formula, they are then compensated, and that would make action, in principle at least, in every nation's immediate interest.
What is compensatory at all about that transfer of those who have created value to those who haven't?
Well, I think that's quite a deep question as to how value is created and whether it is purely just to individuals or not. But I think that there is a widespread feeling that multinational corporations are not paying their fair share of tax simply because they're able to play one government off against another, there needs, that would be one way of making them pay a fairer share of tax, whilst also compensating governments for the costs they're going to have on reducing their emissions.
What is a fair share? What is the fair share? Is it 28%? Is it 21%?
I don't know, Max. It's certainly more than it is now.
Always more than it is now. Okay.
How do you know that it's more? How do you know?
How do I know? I don't. Yeah. But I think, the thing is, guys, is, we can have these kind of philosophical arguments whilst the ship goes down. I don't care. What I'm saying is sooner or later, we're going to have to stop having these philosophical arguments and get on with a pragmatic job of solving the problem.
Well, I just don't see anything terribly pragmatic about redistributing wealth to underdeveloped nations of the world in the manner of foreign aid, which we've seen 50 years of, and it didn't work because kleptocratic governments took those resources and put them in their pockets.
No, I get it, Max. I understand that. And, I'm not saying, SIMPOL does not have, these are just policies, that these are just ideas. Ultimately, it wouldn't be me or SIMPOL that decides what the policies will be. It will be citizens, voting on it democratically. It's not a question of what I think. Really SIMPOL is a process by which citizens and governments can hopefully find an accommodation that solves the practical problem.
Sorry, is it just a democratic strategy? Simply, rather without particular values attached to it?
The process, right?
Yes, mostly, yes, I would say yes, I think that's probably true.
Okay.
I should say that I've been a follower and supporter of SIMPOL for 9 years now, since I came across John Bunzl in 2012. I think fundamentally what I hear you guys reacting to is, again, is there the ghost of globalism buried somewhere here and will rear its head? Is it somehow a slippery slope towards an oppressive world government and so on? And it fundamentally, the idea of SIMPOL, you can correct me if I'm wrong, John, it's a movement or a voter movement enabling mechanism, so that when the voters come to their governments or elected officials and they say, hey, regulate CO2 for climate change, please. And they said, well, sure, I'd like to, but my colleagues in other countries won't. So then all the companies will just move there instead. So I can't, so my hands are tied. So SIMPOL says, okay, we'll do it simultaneously in all countries or in many countries. So the voters get together in many countries simultaneously, and doesn't have to be that large a portion of the voters, just enough to swing votes, right? And they say, we'll only vote for the politicians who are going to do this simple thing, who are going to regulate carbon tax, for instance, or carbon emissions, and then the politicians wouldn't have any excuse. They're saying, well, I can't do it because the other politicians in the other countries won't. Yes, they will. They're forced by their constituencies simultaneously. So it's a coordination mechanism for the transnational civil society to have more influence over those transnational politics where we're ever stuck in prisoner dilemmas.
Yeah.
You would agree with that description.
I would rather there be
just one slight modification, Daniel. It's not we will vote only for, we will give strong preference to politicians that have signed up. So that means that as a citizen, you're not giving SIMPOL your vote.
No.
You are, yeah, okay.
More like letter of intent.
Okay. Max had one comment or a question that before we move on to the closing round. So I would like, Max, do you still want to comment?
I don't like, and look, I'm going to wear a little bit of my priors on my sleeve here. I'm deeply troubled by the idea of any kind of policy harmonization across the world. The whole point of decentralization and polycentrism and polyarchy is that you have pockets of experimentation. You have somewhere to go out from under the thumb of whether it's democratic groupthink. I don't like the idea of being ruled by any of the rubes on the left and right in my own country, much less the world, with their highly diverse interests. And the implementation of some sort of global climate change regime without defection I think is just a fantasy personally. But what's more troubling about it is that there's nowhere to go. And if you could achieve global harmony on these vast policies, particularly of taxation and redistribution, there are no pockets. There's no exit.
There's no exit. I was going to say, Max, aren't you voice and exit?
Mars. There's Mars. Elon.
Exit, voice, and loyalty. When you have this diverse nichification, and you have migration to jurisdictions that are more favorable on some dimension than another, it allows you to experiment with different kinds of social policies, whether that's more socialist, more less socialist, or what have you. And any mechanism that harmonizes policy reduces that, makes the global system more fragile. The very idea of anti-fragility in the like the Taleb sense is that local experimentations can fail without being catastrophic or universal across the globe. When you harmonize the policy across the globe, if it doesn't work, the failure's catastrophic and international. And that
non-harmonization fail is also catastrophic if we don't coordinate. That's the other side of the street. And just as you spoke of holacracy, and holacracy as a governance is also decentralized. But there's also the main circle. It has a strategy, and it cascades down. So if there's no coordination in that top circle, it's difficult. Anyways, guys, you can put your last statement, your last pitch, and then your concluding statement, which we're gonna move to just as of now. Everyone gets 2 minutes to wrap up and say whatever they want to say about the conversation. Tom, is there anything you would like to add to that? So let's maybe start it backwards. How about that? Start with John. John, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you so much for the invitation. Max and Theo, maybe we can continue this. I completely understand your concerns, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit about it separately. But really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Awesome, Max.
Yeah, I hope that what I could leave you with is that what I would support and strongly encourage is just a whole new set of jurisdictions, so that people can play a global game of jurisdictional arbitrage. I think a lot of the global collective action problems that we see, for example, global warming, can be much more readily addressed through complex adaptive systems that with urgent properties. For example, price system. There's a great book by a guy named McAfee, who's an MIT professor and economist, who shows just how ephemeralization of the economy is proceeding pace quite rapidly, which is reducing some of the global emissions and problems with pollution. If we can implement localized Ostrom commons, as in Elinor Ostrom, as well as market-based solutions, I think we can go very far indeed to the kind of experimentation that is necessary to find real solutions that can be replicated. But that requires jurisdictional pluralism and much more than we have now, not harmonization at scale of the planet. And at the end of the day, I think this respects the radical diversity of people and cultures and economic preferences, not only for system preferences, but for personal preferences, while preserving some of the communitarian values that we all share, even if they're global scale communitarian values. We can have these, we can eat our cake and have it too, through radical decentralization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and let's move on to Steve. What's your takeaway?
Sure. Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you all. A lot of very interesting ideas. I'd love to see a bit of conflict, and certainly we're not all on the same page in terms of what's right and wrong, but I took a lot of notes. I think the most interesting thing that I heard that really resonated with me is when Daniel mentioned the developmental imperative, and beyond just a kind of a general sense of if humanity doesn't grow into a better version of itself, it's inevitably going to, to decay into a worse version of itself. Asking the very courageous question of how far can this developmental imperative be taken beyond just an aspirational admonition? What possible collective action that preserves the polarity of liberty and equality? How without maximizing equality or maximizing liberty at the expense of those other, that interdependent relationship. I look forward to discussing that more, thinking about it more, because ultimately I think it's something we have to take seriously, but it's something we have to be very careful because it's not only powerful, it's also dangerous. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'd love to talk to you about that some more.
Thanks. Let's move on to Thaddeus.
Thanks, everyone. I had no idea what I was getting into here. I did not know what the politics of anyone here was. I was orienting myself as I was trying to figure out what to say to you all. I think I have a somewhat decent take on your basic politics. So I've heard the word harmony more than once. More than one of you used that term as an ideal. So I first came across that as a political concept in Plato's Republic. So if you're familiar with that's what Plato says is the good republic. That is how to live is in harmony. Of course, if you know anything about that book, you know that it's a totalitarian nightmare. Harmony means that everyone does what they're supposed to do according to nature. The second time harmony comes up in the history of world political philosophy is in the Catholic Church in the late 19th century, when they say that capitalists and workers should harmonize, and also citizens and heads of state should harmonize as if they were part of a family. And of course, that idea was taken up by Italian fascists shortly after that, and harmony became the central idea animating fascist economics and fascist political economy. All the country is a family. The head of state, whether it's Mussolini or Hitler, is the father. So when I hear people talking about social harmony, I reach for my AK-47. I also want to say that all the talk, any talk of harmony, of managing, of cooperation, globally, certainly, but even nationally, maybe even locally, I'm here to tell you, you Democrats, small d, people who want democracy on any level, I'm here to tell you that I will not do it. Meaning, I will not participate. I will not be democratic. Right? I will not work. I will not go to committees. I will not manage a thing. And so your commitment to democracy is going to come up against not just me, but unfortunately for you, there's millions and millions and millions of other people who simply will not be democratic citizens in any civilization. They will not participate. They will not work. They will not sacrifice themselves, their individual identities, right? For any of this. And that's who I stand with. And you've got to think to yourself, well, what must I do to those people? And that's where violence comes in. And so we have very friendly conversations among very liberal-minded people that are always undergirded, but it's never really recognized, undergirded by that threat of violence. How will you make me be democratic when I don't want to be? And that's a problem I just wish that people who invoke these ideas of harmony, cooperation, and liberalism would confront more. And I thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks. Moving on to Daniel.
Well, yeah. So I mean, a lot of my. I mean, there are many takeaways, but I'll like Thaddeus end with a bit of positioning. Contrarian to most of what you said. I think about liberalism and the main problem or the main crook isn't liberalism. It goes even deeper than that, because liberalism is one out of the several ideologies produced by modernity and its society, and it's in many ways run its course together with the other ones. It's socialism, just as bad. Conservatism, just as bad. Threat of violence present even in anarchist utopias. There's always that thing, what happens if you don't want to be an anarchist? I literally heard a guy say they'll put you in a hospital on an anarchist YouTube channel. And he said, we're not going to send them to Gulag, we're just going to send them to hospitals. So I think at a deeper level, what we're trying to divorce is modernity itself, right? While of course building upon it. So we want a good divorce, not a collapse of civilization or anything like that. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, in decentralization, I really think that decentralization is only possible if we kind of imagine the equilibrium state now being political coordination at the state level, nation state level particularly, to go downwards, to descend into more local decentralization and virtual realities and all of the different combinations and networks and meshworks that can emerge. We also need to coordinate at a higher level. It's like a mirror, it goes both ways. So the coordination at the higher level will lose all legitimacy. And that is, by the way, what's happening right now. We have a huge growth of technocratic structures, of NGOs, of transnational bodies, and we have no democratization or increase of the quality of freedom in people's lives. That's the real essence of democratization, not I will force you to be free, Mr. Rousseau. But in that, I'm actually a globalist. I believe we need something even more radical than what John is suggesting. I think we need structures, transnational structures for commoning and the commons that would pay for transnational collaborations. I think that transnational structures that are non-state structures would be the only viable way to create enough coordination order in the world for experimentation and radical panarchic decentralization to be possible. So, yeah, I just want to say I come out as a globalist.
Thank you. I just wanted to cut you short. So thank you all for this fascinating conversation, also for the contrarian views, and also for the the courage to contradict each other. And yeah, it's been a fantastic. It's a joy for me. I've read many of your books, and
Dennis, I know we're on time, but Max didn't have his last words, I think.
Max, have you spoken already? I think.
Yeah, he did.
I called upon you, right?
Let me see.
I called upon you, right?
I don't remember if it was for the last segment or not. Yeah, I think so. But in any case, I feel I've said enough, and it's just been an absolute blast to be with you all. I think you're all massive brains and big hearts too. And despite all the disagreement, man, that's what made it the most fun. I guarantee you there will be a lot of people who sit and watch the whole thing through.
Right. Yeah, let's hope so. And I'm certainly, I'm sure there's a first part, and there will be a third part, and maybe many parts more. And who knows in which constellations we'll meet again. We certainly, cook up something else here. And yeah, I've been fascinated with the conversation, and I give the last word to Tom, who graciously hosted this on this platform, Parallax. So.
Right. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you all for coming. That was a super interesting conversation. Lots of points of, convergence and some points of contention. I think, it's what it's about, to have a civil discourse, about those things, and to work maybe on some better future and some solutions. So thank you all for coming. Take care, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Tom and Dennis.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.